I forgot to unmute my mic. This music's about to put me to sleep. Alright, I'm just gonna go ahead and start reading because I was very upset that I skipped a couple days because this story is actually starting to get interesting now. Also, chapter 7 is very short. So, we might read more than 2 chapters today. I didn't realize how short 7 was. I'm gonna turn my music down, it's way too loud for me. Alright, chapter 7 is still in Arlo's. Oh, back to Arlo's. We were at Nausicaa's perspective. Now we're at Arlo's POV again. The soft knock at Arlo's door pulled her from her mired thoughts. She watched it creak open, and through the gap peeked a familiar blonde head. It had taken nearly an hour of adamant reassurance for her father to make peace with dropping her off at home that evening. As far as Rory knew, Thallo worked as security detail for some fancy government official, and when he called her personal cell to learn she wouldn't be back home until much later, something about an incident at the Ripley's Aquarium of Canada, this together with Arlo's inability to explain why she had fled the cafe so quickly, had made it difficult to convince her father she would be okay on her own. But all Arlo wanted was to go back home and surround herself with the familiar comforts of her bedroom. Apparently, Thallo was just as concerned about Arlo being alone as her father had been. The blonde head poking into her room belonged to none other than her second cousin, Elias Viridian, and if he was here, Arlo suspected Celadon was as well. Elias and Celadon were the only Viridians, apart from her mother, who cared enough to check on her, and Elias was too young to travel all this way on his own. Arlo? Hey, Elle. Arlo slid off the edge of her bed. It was all the permission High Prince Cerulean's 11-year-old son needed to throw the door wide open and hurl himself inside her room of pastel pinks, cream-colored carpeting, and dollhouse-inspired furniture. Remnants of her childhood. Arlo's taste hadn't exactly outgrown things like the princess canopy above her bed, but her teenage years had added an abundance of video games and manga to her now overflowing bookcases, a plastering of different anime posters to her pink walls, and a veritable mob of collectible figures from all her beloved fandoms to her overcrowded shelves. "Are you okay?" Elias asked, immediately wrapping his arms around Arlo. "Uncle Cell said something happened today and you might be upset." Elias's sensitivity was something she'd hoped he'd never outgrow. He was an absolute brat when he wanted to be, and so much like Celadon in so many ways, not least of all in his delight in causing mischief. His capacity for kindness, though, for compassion and sympathy and love, was so great that it often took even those who knew him best by surprise. But that was Elias. Tall and boyish skinny, Elias looked a great deal like his grandfather, with his jade green eyes and the way his hair curled around his ears. But there was his father, High Prince Cerulean, in the beginnings of his sharpening cheekbones and jaw, and his mother in the starlight blonde hair. Arlo could remember being all of 7 and holding the newborn prince for the very first time. They'd grown up together. Arlo had taught Elias everything she'd known about coloring, and swinging across monkey bars, and playing make-believe, and hosting tea parties for their numerous stuffed animals. She'd been there at every birthday party and every family holiday, and there was so much more left in their lives she wanted to be there for. It hadn't occurred to her until now how easily lost all that could be. It wasn't until today that she appreciated how final death really was. There was so much she would miss out on if she died now, and that girl, Cassandra, barely older than Elias. It was unfathomable to think of him in Cassandra's place, his future as cruelly torn from him as hers had been. Arlo? Yeah? You're squeezing kind of tight. I'm sorry, Arlo muttered, unable to ease her hold in the slightest. Elias breathed a laugh and in response only hugged her tighter. That's okay, you can hug as tight as you need to. I'm sorry you had such a bad day. Uncle Sel said. He said someone died? I'm sorry. Yeah, me too. It wasn't until Elias started rubbing her back that she realized she was crying, now of all times, when she hadn't shed a tear all day. What do you need? He asked her softly. It was funny, somewhere in the back of her head, that he was the one allowing Arlo to break down on his shoulder, as though their roles were reversed and she was the little kid and Elias the newly minted young adult. She cried, and the more tears that fell, the louder her grief became. Celadon appeared in the doorway. Still dressed as he'd been when she'd seen him after school, he'd most likely spent the rest of his day avoiding his father's advisors. When Arlo lifted her head, she saw through her tears his pale look of heart-wrenching relief mixed with profound concern. For some strange reason, this only made it harder for her to contain her grief. I'm sorry, she wailed, pushing out of Elias's hug to draw her arms around her middle. She felt distinctly childish, crying in the middle of her bedroom, and it frustrated her that she couldn't stop. I don't know why I'm crying. Yes, you do, Celadon soothed. He sounded fairly distressed himself, though whether this was because of Arlo's tears or emotions of his own, Arlo couldn't say. Regardless, he pushed his way into the room, and Elias moved aside so Celadon could collect Arlo into a hug of his own. Walking her to her bed, they sat together on its edge. It's all right, he continued to console. It's okay to cry, Arlo. A terrible thing happened in front of you today, and tears are a perfectly healthy, natural reaction. Yeah, I forgot to put my timer on. I didn't even know the girl. Do you need to know a person to feel sympathy for them? You're kind, Arlo, and you feel things deeply. That's not something to be embarrassed about, you know. There's a great many people who go their whole lives without ever learning to feel that compassion, and in my opinion, it's better to feel too much of that than to look on at suffering and feel nothing at all. Arlo thought of the girl, the one in black, whose magic had been so violent, so volatile, that Arlo had been able to feel it like a physical wound. The girl who'd been virtually unaffected by the death of such a young child and had watched it go down like some grade school science project. The girl in black who was quite possibly the one behind everything happening to the Ironborn community lately, the one the folk had labeled their unlucky dark star. Arlo's tears stemmed into sniffles. Can I talk to you about something? Of course you can, Celadon replied. He didn't need it spoken to know she wanted to talk in private. Glancing over at Elias, he said in equal gentleness, Elias, why don't you go warm up those cinnamon rolls we brought? I'm sure Arlo could use a sugar high right about now. Elias wrinkled his nose at Arlo. No one buys me cinnamon rolls when I'm upset, he teased, as he usually did whenever he wanted to defuse the situation and bring a smile to Arlo's face. When did you become the High Queen? Shut up, Arlo teased weakly in return as she wiped the tears from her eyes. Go warm me a cinnamon roll like you were told. The last time you were sad, Celadon bought you a horse. Unable to deny this fact, Elias shot his tongue at Arlo and took his leave. All right, it's just us now, said Celadon. What did you want to talk about? It's about the cafe. Yes, Celadon prompted patiently. She launched into what had gone down at Good Vibes Only, her encounter with the girl in black, and what had really happened to Cassandra, who was maybe Ironborn, but whose death didn't quite match up to the pattern of what had claimed the others. And then she just started glowing. Celadon cocked his head in confusion. What do you mean she started glowing? Like her veins. There was something in her veins, and it started glowing this really bright red, and then she collapsed. It faded when she... But it wasn't a trick of the light, Arlo added hurriedly. It wasn't my imagination. I swear that little girl was glowing, and I don't have any proof apart from what I felt, but I know the girl in black had something to do with it, so I, followed her. Excuse me, you did what? Let me finish, Arlo held up a hand. I followed her. She tried to leave, and I don't know, I guess I was just upset. I didn't really think about what I was doing. You don't say. But I caught up with her on the street and, well, tried to get her to come back to the palace to talk to the king, and one thing led to another and it's very possible the girl in black is the Dark Star, is what I'm trying to say. If Celadon had been wearing pearls, Arlo had the distinct impression he would be clutching them right now in horror. The Dark Star, he repeated faintly. Yes, she was in the cafe. I'm fairly certain, yes. The cafe where a little girl died. Yes. The Dark Star, who is currently under suspicion for the involvement in several murders, was in a cafe where someone lost their life and you thought you'd just try to arrest her all on your own? And what, march her up to the palace steps and present her to my father? Arlo took a breath. It does sound stupid when you say it back at me like that, yes, but you're missing the bigger picture here, Cel. No, I think I have a fairly accurate idea of the picture, Arlo. Do you realize how dangerous that was? Do you realize you could have been killed? Arlo swallowed, fear catching up with her at last. I realize that now. I'm sorry. Cosmin, Arlo, I'm just glad you're alright. He was really worked up about this incident. Celadon didn't invoke the unseelie folk's patron god, however much out of show this worship was anymore, unless he was genuinely upset. You believe me though, right? Celadon gave Arlo a pointed look. Who do you think I am? Of course I do. I don't like what you put yourself in the middle of, but I believe it happened. And if you say that girl was the Dark Star, then that's who she was. It is strange, though, you feeling her magic that acutely. Arlo nodded. I've never felt another person's magic before, not like that. And this was twice in one day, if you count whatever I felt outside the cafe before we went in. 2 different auras. Even we don't share that sort of bond, Celadon finished, his tone gentle in contemplation. I'm closer with you than anyone else. We spent almost all our time together since you were born. You often don't even need to focus to pick up on my aura now. And the same for me with you. But we don't feel each other's magic any more than usual. It's completely possible you one day could, given how strong that talent is in you. But to feel a complete stranger's magic so profoundly and nothing from your own family, well, it's not exactly normal. Arlo flopped back on her bed. She felt exceptionally drained now that she'd offloaded this information she'd been carrying around and was actually looking forward to the Cinnabon cinnamon rolls Celadon used emotional crises as an excuse to buy. Maybe I am cracking up. Maybe you're coming into your magic. I mean, detecting auras that profoundly is more of an immortal talent, not something generally found in the folk, but it's still magic. It could even be a gift. Wonderful. My only superpower is painful sensitivity to others. I'll have to swear off society altogether and live the rest of my days as a hermit. I'll never be able to buy my own pumpkin spice lattes again. You'll have to do it for me. Only if you promise to never again chase down wanted criminals. Celadon rose from the bed. Softer, he added, in all seriousness, are you alright, Arlo? When Thallo came to tell me what happened, she was very worked up. I thought at first something had happened to you. Staring up at the center of her canopy, strung with a mobile of glow-in-the-dark stars, Arlo nodded. I'm alright. No harm done. I'm not the one who died. No, you aren't, and I'm going to be glued to your side for the next little while to remind myself of this fact. But witnessing death is corruption of its own. Whether you notice it yet or not, a part of you did not survive your encounter with what you saw today. For some reason, his words made Arlo laugh. Wow, easy on the wisdom, Gandalf. You've been reading too much human literature again. The death of innocence. That's William Blake's song's thing, right? Celadon frowned, probably at her butchering of one of his favorite author's titles, which only made her laugh again. Thanks anyhow, yeah? She added when she calmed. I think, even though you more or less just called me corrupt. Arlo, a voice sighed from the doorway. Arlo lifted her head to find Elias returned. We have a long way to go before you unlock that achievement. Arlo glanced up at Celadon. This is why my mother says they should stop letting you babysit him. I know, Celadon chimed happily, his way of showing he wasn't concerned about something that might actually be concerning him. Come on, let's go out to the kitchen and gorge ourselves on baked goods, and I'll talk to Father about what you said. It wouldn't hurt for you to tell Thalos too. If the Dark Star is here, we'll find her, so try not to worry, alright? If we need your help, we'll let you know. For now, I think you've been through enough. Nodding, Arlo peeled herself off the bed. She'd done what she could, passed her knowledge on to the ones who could actually use it. There wasn't anything else for it now but to wait and see what the High King did. Hopefully it would be something. The folk labeled the High King's behavior of late erratic. what with him spending more effort chasing down the assistants than the Iron Blood Killer, and naming a veritable ghost the culprit. But Arlo believed he had his reasons. He wouldn't allow a lead like this to go ignored. He wasn't the unfeeling monster the folk were starting to call him. He cared about the Ironborn community just as much as he cared about everyone else under his protection. He'd never once been unkind to Arlo, even if he'd been distant, and the Dark Star, now that she was here, he'd be able to capture her, and the whispers would stop. The folk would remember how good their High King was, both to them and at his job. In the very least, they'd make some progress. Arlo might even learn a few answers to the questions starting to burn in her mind. For instance, if Cassandra was Ironborn, what had all that glowing been about? Had that happened with the others? Would that girl in black have somehow stolen Cassandra away to mangle her, as every other victim suffered? Why? And underneath all this, if it was so unusual to actually feel auras of the folk, if that was a talent better attributed to gods, was it possible what she felt hadn't been one of the folk? Arlo was no immortal. Her mother was Fae and her father was human, but they knew next to nothing about the Dark Star. They didn't know who she was. They didn't know what she was. The Dark Star's background was a complete mystery to them, and no one had any idea what they could possibly have done to earn her very apparent contempt. What if, in addition to Arlo's magic getting stronger, the Dark Star was someone who shouldn't be here, an immortal in breach of the treaty that kept them out of the mortal realm? What would it mean for Arlo's world if she was? Arlo followed her cousins out of her room into the kitchen, a whole new concern blooming inside her chest. She could only hope that her instincts were wrong and it wasn't the beginning of a crisis worse than the one they were currently in. Yeah, it's probably about to be an even worse crisis. My back is killing me. Reading makes me thirsty. Why was my phone going off? Oh, that's why my phone was going off. Sorry, I have streams to pull up to lurk in. That's why my phone was going off. Alright. Chapter 8 is in Vahan's point of view. It didn't surprise Vahan that the forum shops at Caesar's were busy. They were always busy, especially this time of year. This expansive luxury shopping mall attracted a lot of attention, and not only because of its location in the heart of the Las Vegas Strip, or its impressive showcase of designer human fashion. No, what made the forum so enchanting was a presentation of it all. Its entrance greeted visitors with grandeur reminiscent of an ancient Roman palace. It had high-flung ceilings and gleaming white columns, a sunken fountain, stunning classical architecture, and sculptures of human philosophers and heroes. A spiral escalator carried people up to other levels, and it was here the forum truly became itself. Here, that cracked stone flooring and glowing lampposts guided patrons from one thematic shop to the next. Everything framed by gilded stucco work and exquisite carvings, and yet more marble columns. What Vahan found more exciting than anything else was the barrel-vaulted ceiling overhead. There, painted clouds and clear blue sky were somehow made to stimulate the various times of day, the finishing touch to this out-of-doors atmosphere. Glowing bright through morning and noon, dimming soft once twilight fell, this display of ingenuity was a perfect reminder that humans weren't as hopeless as they seemed, and a challenge the folk couldn't let pass to prove they could do better. Sealy Summer had pulled out every stop in the market they'd built to compete with this. Alright, if I were the Goblin Market, where would I be? Vahan mused. To Aurelian, he added, "You know, I'm surprised it took us this long to think of coming here, especially when you consider how much time we used to spend in this mall." Overcome by a sudden surge of memories that simply being here invoked, he paused outside a shop window where several mannequins in various wardrobes looked slightlessly down at him. Once upon a time, he and Aurelian had been much closer than they were now. Once upon a time, they'd been best friends. They'd watched shows together on Aurelian's laptop so late till the night they often fell asleep in a huddle around it. They'd snuck into the kitchens after everyone else had gone to bed to feast on the cakes and tarts and sweets Aurelian's parents purposefully left out for them. Delectable things, those goods, and the very reason Vahan's mother had poached Aurelian's parents from Sealy Autumn with an offer of a royal warrant of appointment, an award that proclaimed them the official I never knew how to pronounce this. Patissiers? The pastry people of her court, when she and Vahan had first tasted them on years ago vacation abroad. Yeah, it's whatever pastry people are called. Patissiers? I feel like that's pronounced differently because it's like French or something. Vahan and Aurelian had played together, trained together, laughed and learned and explored together. One of their favorite pastimes had been coming here to the mall, because Aurelian was fairly obsessed with all things human, and Vahan was fairly obsessed with him, this first ever person who seemed to like Vahan for Vahan, and not for the trimmings and trappings and privileges that made a prince. Why that changed, Vahan had a good guess. When it changed, he knew clearly. It was right after his mother proclaimed Aurelian as Vahan's steward, turning their friendship into a shackle. And never mind that the role was far from what Aurelian wanted for himself. From that moment on, Aurelian could barely look him in the eye. These days, Vahan tried to make the duty that bound them together as painless and impersonal as possible, to give Aurelian the space he obviously wanted. But it was hard to forget he'd been half in love with Aurelian once upon a time. Even harder to forget he was still very much so now. "We were never looking for the market back then," came Aurelian's placid reply, and Vahan startled, remembering only now that he'd asked the question. "Correction, you weren't looking for it. I was. It's the Goblin Market. What sort of kid doesn't want to go someplace you can trade memories for wishes, or locks of hair for ambrosia, or buy dwarven weapons, or drink salted ale with merfolk, or... Found it." Aurelian pointed across the way. In between a store selling shoes and another selling lingerie was a door no more exciting than that, a door. It was solid and narrow, upholstered in pearl white velvet, but despite its uniform color, it looked out of place next to everything else around it. Magic bent the light around it to ever so slightly set it apart from the mundane. "Finally," Vahan said through a sigh. "This would have been so much easier if the entrance just stayed in one place. Well, let's go find our troubles then." Only those with magic in their blood would be able to locate this door and open it. Of course, the Goblin Market was firm about their age restriction. Any human or underage child of magic who looked at its entrance saw plain white painted metal and staff only stamped across its surface. If they tried to enter through it, all it led to was a flight of stairs that would take them back outside. But for folk who were mature, Vahan and Aurelian pushed through and found themselves in a compact reception. The floor was carpeted in plush dark gold. The walls were plastered with shimmery paper, depicting a bamboo forest bathed in dawn, which swayed and rustled and made all the same noises as though it were real. There was seating provided, soft with the same pearly velvet as what had been on the door, but these Vahan ignored. He made straight for the counter stretched along the right side of the room. "Hello," he greeted her warmly. The fairy girl behind it looked up from the magazine she'd been reading. She had emerald green hair and bright lavender skin, cat's ears twitching on her head, and the brilliant multicolored hue of her eyes meant she was most likely a shifter. She blinked at Vahan and then at Aurelian, and a moment later her entire expression brightened. "Hello, handsome," she purred. "Here for the goblin market, or is there something else I can help you with?" There was very clearly something else she was prepared to offer, her unspoken proposition easy to read. Vahan was used to this sort of interaction, even when people didn't recognize who he was. He was handsome and he knew it. On the prettier side, as were many of the Fae, and an awful lot of the world was weak to a pair of bright blue eyes, black hair, and the casual flirtation Vahan employed in his easy smiles. "Another time, maybe," he winked, earning a laugh from the fairy girl and the barest hint of a groan from Aurelian, who stood a step behind him. "Just the goblin market today, I'm afraid." "Well, all right, you know where to find me if you change your mind." She gave him another glance over. Vahan could see she was trying to determine why he looked so familiar, and then a second look at Aurelian that said she wouldn't mind at all if he took her up her offer as well, which Vahan didn't like half as much, and made his smile shrink a molar. Then she pointed back at the door where they'd entered. "You're free to go on through." "Tito! Hello, Tito!" A popular trick in the magical community, these doors that led to different places depending on the way you turned their knobs, or where you knocked, or how you described where you wanted to go. They were mostly reserved for things like this, for places that saw a lot of magical traffic that needed conducting, but weren't a government practice that could afford police or court involvement. "Thank you," he said. They made for the door. There had been no knob on the outside. All they needed to do was push for the door to let them through. There was one on this side, though, and just above it was a sign in Braille, a button that would read the sign aloud, and on top of that, the same sign again, written out, "Forum" on the left and "Market" on the right. At the moment, "Forum" was lit up gold. When Vahan turned the knob right, it flicked over to light up "Market." "Are you ready?" Aurelian rolled his eyes at the excitement in Vahan's voice. He couldn't help himself. He'd been wanting to come here for so long, and until now, hadn't been able to for everything going on. He opened the door, and as soon as he stepped out the other side, it was as though he'd been sucked into a completely separate dimension. Come by." This tongue-in-cheek wooden sign stood before them, little wooden hands pointing off in every direction. Beyond it was the Forum, completely altered. The ceiling was no mere painting any longer, but actual sky, trapped in twilight, scraped from the heavens and plastered above them. The bulbs in the numerous lampposts have been replaced with real fire. The shops weren't merely fronts now, but entire buildings of all shapes and colors, red and blue and green and lilac, large and small and bulbous and narrow. Some made of stone, some made of wood, others bits of vibrant canvas and swatches of luxurious silk. Some were only visible if you caught them at certain angles, or as Vahan had been told, the stroke of every hour. Set against yet more of the shimmery forests that papered the walls of the market's reception, it seemed to Vahan as though this space stretched on forever, filled with the scent of pine and crisp fresh air, wood smoke steaming from scattered chimneys, and the savory, spicy, mouth-watering scents of various fairy foods. "This way," said Aurelian, touching Vahan's elbow as he passed to draw his attention. "We might as well start our search with this floor." "Hello, Kenyo." They'd never been here before. They didn't really know what they were looking for, apart from some sign that someone might know anything at all about what was going on with the human kidnappings and dying Ironborn. However hard the courts worked to regulate the magical community, to ensure the folk conformed to modern codes and practices, there was no stamping out the old ways altogether. There was always some unsanctioned revel the Faucian police force had to disband. Turf wars broke out on a regular basis between the many fairy gangs over every oak and ash and thorn they could stake their claim on. Household sprites, those gentle fairies who took to hearts of happy, cozy human homes, were constantly getting into places they shouldn't, and forever needing to be chased back to pre-approved ironborn hosts. Even the Fae found city life difficult. The folk detested money, for a start, considered it offensive to trade things for cash. While interaction with humans any more than necessary was discouraged, it couldn't be avoided altogether. It was almost a daily occurrence, therefore, that one of the folk would try to make purchases in human stores with gems instead of proper currencies, or with things like spider silk or even a blessing, which was nothing more magical than a fairy they'd later bully into paying special attention to the human's land or helping them along with something. The folk were a stubborn people. They rebelled in many ways against their continuously evolving lifestyle. It allowed them to keep their existence a secret, yes, but every tradition they were forced to shed for the good of the courts stirred more and more agitation among them. Goblin markets had become a refuge of sorts. There were more than just the obvious collection of vendors. The folk had more than enough stores at their disposal, glamored to look like condemned buildings to human passerby. They had vendors on the streets whose wares were magic to be wholly unappealing to human senses, but to the folk were all manner of fairy-made items. The goblin markets, even the most uncompromising of counselors was loath to disband a place where anything the heart desired could be obtained, and if what the heart desired was information, well, there was no place better to find it. As Vahan trailed behind his retainer, his head turned this way and that. Come by, come by. These signs were everywhere, stamped on posts, scrawled over doorways, winking down at them on fluttering banners. Vendors shouted it out at the street. They passed a menagerie where caged birds with rainbow plumage and actual flaming tails had been trained to call it out. There were other shouts too, promises of dreams come true, of fruit that melted like honey in your mouth, of tailors who could spin a dress or suit out of anything, from petals and glittering insect wings to moonlight and morning fog. Vahan overheard a diminutive fairy who looked no older than a child, but had eyes as old as earth and skin the color of rubies, informed passers-by that his business would give them cents more than the banks in their American currency exchange. Come by, no questions asked, no trade denied. Is your neighborhood scheduled for inspection? Don't want the Faucian to find those old alchemy textbooks you have tucked in your homes? A cursed amulet to dispose of? A bit of vampire blood to spare? We'll take it all. Your goods for human cash. 10 cents more on the exchange. Come by, we can't be beat. The forum statues had taken on life. Vahan noticed as they walked on. They added to the chatter, conversing with one another, arguing, providing running commentary on the people below them, and sparking fights between easily riled fairies who needed very little encouragement to turn nasty on one another. These statues were no longer the likeness of Roman figures, but illustrious folk long dead. When Vahan and Aurelian reached the forum's fountain of the gods, in place of the Roman deities that stood there, on the human side were colossal sculptures of Uriel, with her robes of fire and water and wind, a crown of light atop her head. Tellus, with her gown of moss and leaves and fur, hers a crown of stone, and Cosmin, draped in starry night, beset with his crown of bone, the great three, Western gods of old and the folk in this portion of the world had once worshipped above all others. There were other gods for other courts, whose statues probably stood in their markets just like this. Vahan had never seen such grand and undefiled depictions of the Great Three, though. The gods had been driven from this realm by the 8 founders of the courts. Those heroes he had looked up to, who'd unified the folk against these immortal sovereigns and together devised a way to free mortals from their tyrannical rule. These statues glared down at Vahan as he passed, made him feel uneasy and small and hot around the ears, and he pressed a little closer to Aurelian, who must have been feeling the same as well, for he allowed it without comment. The further they walked, the harder it was to remember why they'd come. They passed vendors selling apples red as wine, and every bite just as intoxicating. Stalls selling vials of unicorn tears, which would allow the user temporary clairvoyance. Shadowy nooks where one could purchase roses grown on the graves of beautiful people who death had stolen in their prime, and anyone the buyer gave these out to would supposedly attract untimely demise. One of the courtyards they came across had a massive aquarium at its center, and in it was an actual mermaid, with sea spray white hair, sunset orange skin, large yellow eyes, and a long iridescent tail the color of newly fallen snow. Vahan couldn't help but gawk. Understandably, he felt, as merfolk didn't leave their waters often, and were therefore a rare encounter. Not to mention their voices were a magic designed to produce such a reaction. If Vahan listened long enough, she would convince him to do anything she willed into her song. At the moment, her song was a jingle, living advertisement for the Mermaid Tavern, then, which Vahan suspected must be somewhere nearby. And suddenly, desperately, he wanted to visit. He only startled out of his appreciation when Aurelian cleared his throat. Do you think Mother would let me bring Zale as a date to the solstice if I promise to dance with whoever she wants me to? Vahan asked, more to feel the awkward silence than anything. Zale, the only mer Vahan had ever seen besides the one in the tank, was conveniently in his mother's employ. He hadn't been Vahan's bisexual awakening, even Aurelian didn't possess that honor, but he'd been the first of the folk to consistently knock Vahan on his ass any time they sparred together. This hadn't changed over the years. No matter how good Vahan was with swords and magic and hand-to-hand combat, Zale was always better, and apparently Vahan's attraction to other people correlated directly with how much they frustrated him. Aurelian frowned. It was very unfair, another one of those frustrating/attractive things, and something Aurelian did a lot these days. It certainly didn't help Vahan's whole try and get over your hot best friend thing any. I think you don't have a choice about the dancing, Aurelian replied, and Zale is almost 30. Yo, he's into older men. Vahan snorted. So, my mother had way more years than that on my father. He waved a hand. At a certain point, people stop caring about age so long as it's all consensual and both parties are mature. To a degree, sure. You're not at that point yet, though. Vahan rolled his eyes. Aurelian was always touchy on the subject of Vahan's attraction to Zale. Okay, Dad, but I suppose I don't want Zale to lose his job or die on the murderous rampage. Just asking that of Mother would probably set off. Do you think she's given High Prince Celadon an invitation? To the solstice? No, to the open season on my hand in marriage. He laughed, but that was more or less what this was turning into. His mother announcing his maturity to all the Fae elite like he was some blushing debutante, and her only purpose in life was to see him make an excellent match. However much she despised the High Prince and the Viridian family as a whole for their patriarch, Azurian, beating her to challenging his father for the crown that made him High King, Celadon was young enough and well enough connected that it would be foolish of her not to consider him. It's that name that I don't remember how to pronounce. Riadne Lestern was many things, but foolish she was not. To this, though, Aurelian said nothing. A muscle leaped in his jaw, which meant his silence wasn't for lack of comment, but where once Vahan hadn't been able to get his friend to stop talking about video games and human technology, and oh goodness, did Aurelian ever find space and Star Trek fascinating. But now conversation was like pulling teeth. Vahan considered himself lucky they'd been talking as much as they currently were. Oh, thank you, Hadel. My back was starting to hurt. I will also drink water. I'm sorry it's probably taking me like forever to respond to people, but I'm reading, so it's hard to notice chat when I'm reading. And I gotta remember where I was at. That's where I was at. Okay. A splash broke their conversation, followed quickly by whoops of laughter and vicious delight. Vahan turned to look. A large and grisly canary yellow red cap had apparently done something to irritate the on-duty mermaid, because she had lured him up and over the tank's ledge, lion's tail streaming behind him as he sunk down to his grave. His scythe, sharp and well-maintained, glittered on the cobblestones where he dropped it. His crimson hood, stained dark by human blood, floated atop the tank's rippling surface. The laughter turned into cheers when the mermaid unsheathed both claws and teeth and lunged at her prey. The tank was instantly filled with vibrant blue blood. Vahan shook his head at the spectacle. Granted, that red cat probably deserved what he got, but the folk were getting nastier and nastier to one another the longer they went denied of their long-ago freedoms. Murder was just as illegal in the courts as it was in human society, but here in the Goblin Market, so long as the Falchian were handsomely paid off, law was content to look the other way, and it was expected of Vahan to do the same. Oh, it's okay, Hadel, you can be disruptive. But I do appreciate them because I do keep slouching and hurting my back and not drinking and my mouth is getting dry while reading. So thank you for reminding me to do those things. And I forgot where I'm at now. A little less interested in the sights and a little more subdued, he fell into step beside Aurelian, and together they wandered the market in deeper silence than before. Until, hang on, that looks promising. Very Slight Forces, read the shop's name, beneath it, psychic readings, an oracle. The shop was small, slotted in between two other much larger businesses, but quaint. It had large frosted windows and a lavender-painted front door, emerald shutters, and a matching slanted roof. If anyone knows what's going on in the world, it would be an oracle. Vahan looked to Aurelian. Did my music stop? Or is it just doing something really quiet right now? There, okay. It was just got very quiet. His retainer looked back at him, molten gold eyes as fathomless as they were intense. Aurelian was gorgeous. A lot of folk, particularly of the fave variety, would look at his tattoos and piercings as obscene, too human for their taste. There were many things the folk appreciated about adopting human eyes, but this wasn't one of them, and the people at the palace were constantly getting after Aurelian for things like his ripped skinny jeans and the brown and black shirts he favored. Colors of autumn, not Sealy Summer's white and gold. They'd been quick to stamp out his German accent, quick to counteract the human public school education he'd preferred with enrollment in the Nevada Fay Academy, quick to deny the things he enjoyed, his hopes and ambitions, like attending human university and pursuing those sciences he loved so fiercely, all because it wasn't suitable for someone in training to be the future king's steward, a role Aurelian had been forced into when the queen realized how good he was with her son. Vahan had never been one of those people to look at Aurelian and see any of his passions as wrong. Aurelian had always been beautiful, even more so when he was free to be himself. But of course he wasn't free, not anymore. Not thanks to Vahan, who could no longer meet his gaze without feeling gut-wrenching guilt. He hated what had become of their relationship, and hated even more his bitterness about being punished for something that wasn't his fault. Hello, Pyro. The book is good. Stuff is happening. I see you rigged your battle royale again. Yeah, stuff's happening. Sure. You didn't know that you rigged your own battle royale. I keep forgetting where I'm at. Well, don't do that. You should have went to the bathroom sooner. Oh, yeah, I guess I should have put that content warning out before I started the book. Okay, I will. Have good art. Do good art. It was hard to pretend things were fine between them with all of this, yet pretend he did. Want to check it out? He asked, swallowing down his rampant emotions. If you do, Your Highness. Ignoring the way Aurelian's use of this title made his skin crawl, Vahan nodded and started forward. What? Tito, I don't know if you're also in my stream. Why are you asking if I'm made of cake? No, I'm not made of cake. I don't know if Tito can hear me, but I see his messages. As soon as he entered Very Slight Forces, he was overwhelmed by incense. Despite the market's dim lighting, the shop was even darker, and it took a moment for his sight to adjust to the gloom. Once it did, he found himself in an open concept room. The front was lined with shelves against the walls, stuffed with jars of animal bits, insects, and plants, crystals of every size and hue, delicately painted tarot cards, candles, books. Hanging from the ceiling were various dried herbs, a pair of pixie wings, which would fetch quite a lot of money and just as much jail time for possession alone, as well as antlers and horns and teeth and pelts from all manners of creatures, magical and otherwise. Off to his left, a wooden staircase wound up and disappeared into a second floor. At the back of the shop sat a glass case counter with more occult paraphernalia, but before Vahan could examine it too closely, "I was beginning to think you wouldn't come," said the woman standing behind it. Vahan stared. She was old enough that lines had set permanently around her eyes, and mouth and nose, but young enough that gray only streaked her dark brown hair in muted wisps. Fae could easily live for hundreds of years, some nearing close to 1,000. Many fairies could as well. The rest merely enjoyed a life extended by a handful of decades, with better health and less wear. This woman's eyes were bright, her features handsome, but something about the rosy glow of her emerald-tinted, snake-scaled skin told Vahan she was Ironborn, and a practicing one at that. Practicing? What does that mean? Oh, alchemy? Maybe, I guess? The items for sale in her shop made sense now. These were all things that went into potions and spells. Those books most likely tomes of arrays and enchantments. Behind the woman was a fireplace, a cauldron set in its unlit heart, with symbols stamped into the wood that Vahan recognized as alchemy from all the secret research he'd done of late. Ah, so yeah, it is alchemy. Alchemy. An alchemist who was also an oracle. This was almost a little too lucky. If this woman knew what was happening to her own people, chances were she wouldn't charge as steep a price as others might to give Vahan the means to help. "Hello," he greeted her warily. The folk were tricksters at heart, particularly the fairies, and the market could be a dangerous place, existing outside the law as it did. It was possible this woman wasn't who he thought she was, and if she wasn't, how she knew he would be coming was concerning. "Expecting us, were you?" "Yes and no," the oracle said with a smile. "Just because I saw you coming doesn't mean you'd choose this path. The future is no certain thing, you know, even for those to whom it speaks." Oracles. Vahan resisted the urge to roll his eyes, but he had a feeling Aurelian wasn't taking such care behind him. Quite the skeptic, his retainer, when it came to those who predicted futures. Oh, there's gonna be an ad in a minute. These days, true oracles were rare, almost non-existent. With the gods now banished from this realm, this skill could no longer be given out to their favored worshippers, as it had once been. It had to be inherited from ancestors of those the gods had blessed long ago. And Aurelian wasn't the only one whose first reaction to someone claiming their art genuine was unflinching doubt. It's not every day you meet a one-day king. Come closer, boy. Let me get a good look at you. Vahan stepped forward as bidden. Aurelian followed fast at his heel. Whatever hurt existed between them, he knew Aurelian wouldn't let him come to harm, and was very suspicious of situations in which harm could easily reach him. Just as pretty as they say you are. Thanks, he grinned, though the action wasn't up to its usual brilliance. I try not to disappoint. Yes, you do, don't you? Both tone and smile curled around some private amusement. She was no longer talking solely about Vahan's appearance. So eager to please, to prove yourself worthy. Welcome to Very Slight Forces, Vahan Lestern, Crown Prince of Seelie Summer. My name is Lydia. What brings you here today? What? Vahan joked, unable to help himself. You don't know? Yes and no, Lydia replied serenely. If she was at all nervous about a pair of royal fae visiting her very illegal shop, she didn't show it. I'd like for you to say it. Very well, I'll get right to it then. I'm here because Ironborn children have been dying. I'm here because humans have been disappearing from the streets, kidnapped and never seen again. I'm here because I know it's connected. I know it isn't another human doing this, like the High King has ruled, or the Dark Star, whom everyone is looking to blame. I know this is all serving some magical plot. I just don't have any proof, and I would like to know where that can be found. Will you tell me? I will indeed, little light, but nothing comes without a price. Vahan knew that well. The entire magical community was built on the concept. I'm aware. Name your trade. A moment of silence filled the shop while Lydia thought on her reply. There were a number of things she could easily request of him. As a prince, he had so much more to give than her regular clientele, not least of all a guise that was no small thing to hold over him. Vahan had more than enough time to weigh what he would and wouldn't be prepared to give for answers today, but for some reason, on the cusp of learning just what this quest would cost him, he felt a little anxious. Why does it matter to you, a fae, that Ironborn are dying and humans are going missing? Vahan almost laughed. Was this question her price? It was nothing. He was asked this often, every time he'd ask another person about these events or voiced his opinions about them. Why? He scoffed. I'm the Prince of Seelie Summer. These are my people being made a target. They are all folk, and it's my duty to protect them. Lydia laughed where Vahan refrained. A noble sentient, she came out from behind her counter at last, pulling her brown cable-knit shawl tighter around her wide-set frame. Very noble, my little light. Our esteemable court founders would be so proud to hear you spout this, but they're just words. Why does this matter to you? She repeated. Is this your price? He asked, wariness seeping back into his tone. He wanted to be clear on their trade, before she could decide on something else once terms were met. This is my price. A truth for a truth. Vahan sighed. It's not just words. It is my duty. Did you know I was the one who reported the first Ironborn death? He glanced at Aurelian, unsure as to whether he should continue. But it wasn't as though this information was a secret, and if this was all she wanted in exchange for what she knew. It was a few years ago now, 3 maybe. Aurelian and I were walking home from school when we noticed an Ironborn teenager slumped over on a park bench. Aurelian said he was glowing, something red in his veins that was quickly fading. I couldn't see it at all, but Aurelian is the Cid. His magic is different and allows him to see things Cid Fae can't, things like active alchemy, for instance. I didn't question it. We went over to help the boy, but by the time we got there, he was already dead. Shirt ripped to shreds, chest scored with bloody lines, and gore under his nails. The next thing we knew, the human authorities were there and ushering us back, but before we were forced to leave, I was able to glimpse what had caused him so much pain and had driven him to try to claw his way through his breast, because yes, he had done it to himself. Death hadn't been all that real to Vahan until he held the lifeless body of that iron-born boy in the park. It had only existed as a concept. His father had died when Vahan had been too young to make much sense of it, other than the fact that he was gone, and no amount of waiting in his personal rooms, morning and night for a whole month, would see him returned. "It's my duty to see this resolved," he said with renewed conviction. "I was there in the beginning. I couldn't help that boy, but I can stop it from happening to others. Please, do you know who's behind this? Do you know where I can go to look for answers if you don't?" "I do," Lydia replied, "but why does this matter to you?" Vahan gritted his teeth. There was nothing for it. He would have to show her, and the very least, this secret should satiate her thirst for private information about him. "You want a truth?" He stepped forward, yanking his white cotton shirt at the hem and up to his shoulders. He bared his chest for the woman to see. Aurelian, startled, made a noise of protest, but in his current irritation, Vahan didn't care how highly inappropriate this scene would have looked to anyone walking in on it. "There, you see it, right? An array. The exact same array that the Ironborn boy had. It's mostly faded now. Hard to tell it's there. It's mostly faded now. Hard to tell it's there, I know, or even what it is. But I've had it long enough to recognize it anywhere. I'm branded, just the way every other Ironborn who's died was. I'm sure of it, and no one can tell me why." He righted his shirt, glaring now at the Oracle, daring her to tell him this wasn't enough of a trade. Still, she said nothing. Vahan shook his head in frustration. "It hurts, you know. It doesn't glow, but it hurts at random. I never thought much of it before now. When I first asked my mother about it, she told me it was just a scar. She told me I had been injured as an infant, grievously so, an attempt on my life gone wrong, and that injury had left a mark they'd never been able to fully heal. I never had cause to investigate what sort of mark this could be. I'd been content with that answer. But some magics, Madam Oracle, have indelible impressions. That boy, like me, must have come into contact with something dark, and I want to uncover what it was. Will you tell me?" he repeated, firm and commanding as the future head of Seelie Summer that he was. Lydia stared at his chest, expression guarded. Vahan considered it a win that her smile had finally fallen, until, interesting, but it's still not the truth. Why does it? This insufferable woman, was that not enough? What was she looking for him to say here? That this matters to him because, what, he has some secret fetish for dead bodies she could one day use against him? I'm sorry, people are dying. Why shouldn't that matter to me? If you want to know the truth, you'll have to give a truth in exchange. A price must be paid, Prince Vahan. Why does this matter? Because it does. Why? Because I care. Why? Because no one else does, he shouted, taking even himself by surprise. But he was at the end of his patience. Nobody cares. People are dying and nobody cares. An entire community of people made to feel that they don't matter. It makes me sick. It eats at me, because feeling that, the soul-crushing hopelessness that drowns everything else inside you, and tells you you're totally and completely alone, that you're nothing but a tool, a means to an end, a burden, and no one will really miss you when you're gone, I know exactly what that's like. His mother, who constantly moved her expectations of him higher and higher each time they were met, always convinced he could do better. His best friend, who resented him and no longer wanted anything to do with him. All the people around him, his schoolmates, his advisors, his tutors, his family, everyone looked at him like a thing to be used, molded, endured, eliminated, even to get what they wanted. Vahan wasn't happy. He had a good life, a life people envied, full of wealth and security and anything he could ever want, except a single God's-damned person to genuinely care he existed at all, and he was not happy. The amount he was not happy was growing quite difficult to manage, in fact. Normally he could hide it away behind his smiles and easy charm, but at the moment forced into this hideous game he should have known better than to undertake so lightly. Feeling that? His voice cracked. It's awful. I'm selfish. Is that what you want to hear? I'm projecting. This is all about me and my pathetic emotions. I just want to protect someone the way no one wants to protect me. Tears threatened to fall at any second. Vahan wanted nothing more than to leave. He'd never meant to say any of that, would never say it in front of his mother, who would only reaffirm he was being ridiculous, and he'd never absolutely ever wanted to admit such things in front of Aurelian. He didn't want Aurelian to feel like it was his fault. Vahan was unhappy, that he shouldn't want a life that was his own, and he owed Vahan anything more than he'd already given. There was silence. His confession rang louder in his ears for it. There it is, said Lydia at last. Her gaze had turned on Aurelian, though, and Vahan couldn't say why, only that he appreciated the chance to collect himself. For a people who at pains to tell lies, you're very bad at admitting truths. She turned her attention back to Vahan, a softness in her expression now that almost looked like pity. It made him feel worse. The price is met. Word in the market is that folk are being offered large sums of gold in exchange for people no one would miss. The facility you'll find right here in the Nevada desert. Iron Teeth will show you the way. But now this, only once the stars align will you receive the answers you seek. Vahan clenched his fist. Wonderful, very helpful. He had many questions, why oracles insisted on imparting their wisdom in riddles. He would have appreciated if she'd been straightforward with him, but it didn't matter right now. He'd worry about that later. Right now he was done. He abruptly turned to leave, decidedly not meeting Aurelian's gaze when, "Excuse yourself, watch where you're going. This suit is very expensive." He ran right into the chest of a middle-aged man standing in the doorway, wearing black leather gloves and a very nice midnight black suit. Indeed, his equally black hair glossy and carefully groomed. "I'm sorry," Vahan choked out, hardly able to hear his own words. "Don't be sorry, boy, be careful." And the man's withering reply. The way he looked down at Vahan hinted he knew exactly who he was. He simply didn't care. It was unsurprising. In the market where the common folk ruled supreme, royal Cid status was more of a hindrance than anything else. "Ah, Mr. Aurum." "Aurum?" "Right on time. Here to restock already?" "My, but you've been busy lately," Lydia said, looking quite pointedly at Vahan as she spoke, clearly wanting him to leave before he caused a scene. "Good day, Madam Oracle," Aurelian interjected, striding forward now too. He took Vahan by the shoulders and guided him carefully from the shop, and Vahan did his best to avoid looking up at his face their entire journey home. He didn't think he'd be able to handle what he might find in his former friend's expression, the pity, the dismay, or worse, confirmation that Aurelian didn't care about him at all. Oh, my nose is so itchy. How long is this next chapter? No, that's not very long at all. Oh. I'm going to go to the bathroom real quick, and then we will read one more chapter because it's not that long. Okay, I am back. Tito is yet again asking me if I am made of cake. Oh my god, my nose is so itchy. Alright, we're on chapter 9, and this is in Arlo's perspective again. The Verdant Palace of Spring, named the Reverdy by its Viridian founder, was a beautifully sleek construction of curved glass and steel. It wasn't all that different from everything else where it was stationed on Bloor Street's crowded stretch of high-end outlets and commercial buildings, but the multiple glamours concealing it, its appearance, rendered it invisible to anyone who didn't know it was there. Arlo loved the Reverdy? I guess is how you say that? Its wave-like shape had been designed to resemble a curl of breeze, a tribute to the element of air that unseelie spring fae commanded, and was every bit as opulent on the inside as what humans always described of fairy palaces. Walls and floors and high-reaching volumes of green-tinted soapstone, marble and jade, enormous chandeliers dripping crystals like the ice their season melted. Gold-leafed carvings and tapestries of living butterflies that fluttered from place to place. Fan-vaulted ceilings, painted to resemble forest canopies, which actually rustled and swayed in breezes and shook in passing storms. The palace was decadent, a spectacle at every turn, but the carpets of moss and the lush profusion of plants and flowers that grew over every surface lent it the appearance of having been plucked out of a long-forgotten time. This impressive, sprawling overgrowth was the High King's influence. As one of the two heads of spring, wherever he went, so followed verdant life. It was the same for all the heads of the great courts, though for the High King, as sovereign over all, this effect was to a much greater degree. I lost where I was after one sentence. Winter trailed frost, summer radiance, and autumn a colorful decay. The Reverdy was Arlo's only encounter with any of these formidable gifts. It was, after all, only in a head's close vicinity that this magic was ever this noticeable. What she could do without was the feeling of the High King's magic stripping away her glamour, as it did for any and all who entered the palace. The sensation, quite like stepping through a gust of wind, always left her tingling and raw. Beyond the slight sharpening of her features, pointed definition to her ears, and a little more vibrancy to her eyes, she never looked much different on the other side of this trick either, so it was more than a touch of disappointing, especially considering what it did to everyone else. "Afternoon, Arlo," said Dag, waving her through the tower's second set of glass front doors. "Here to visit High Prince Celadon?" Arlo nodded. "Good," he grunted. Dag was a dwarf. He was just over 4 feet tall and built like a boulder, with most of his warm brown face consumed by his copper hair and matching bushy beard. Random braids were twisted throughout, no doubt left by his partner. It was a fairy superstition to which even Fae subscribed, most believing the braids offered their loved ones protection from ill intent. Dag was perhaps Arlo's favorite guard, the only one who didn't press beyond what his job demanded whenever she came to visit, but today she felt even more grateful to see him than usual. What had followed the ordeal at the cafe had been comparatively uneventful. Spending that awful night with her cousins, binge-watching feel-good movies on Netflix, with cups of warm cocoa and Celadon cinnamon rolls, left Arlo feeling much more like her usual self. Now, a few days later, and in better spirits, her thoughts were able to wander back to curiosity. The High King had yet to act on the knowledge passed along to him. This further proof that the already suspicious Dark Star might know more about what was going on than she'd been letting on. At least he hadn't done anything publicly. This wasn't too concerning to Arlo, not yet. The High King who commanded all, the heads that served him and ruled their courts according to his wishes, and whatever freedom he otherwise allowed. the Fae High Council that served as the only voice the rest of the courts had, and the decisions the High King made. They all had been right-lipped from the start of this matter. Tight-lipped. There was much going on behind the scenes that Arlo wasn't privy to. She knew that, but still. She'd rest easier if someone could tell her something was being done. The longer this silence stretched on, when one day turned into two, and neither Celadon nor her mother had any update to share with her other than the fact that Cassandra had indeed been Ironborn, as Arlo had suspected, the more impatient she became. What if that girl in black decided to go into hiding now that she knew Arlo was onto her? What if this was their only chance to figure out who was killing Ironborn children and why, and it slipped between their fingers because Celadon had forgotten to tell his father a key piece of information that might have incentivized the High King to act quicker? That Cassandra had been glowing, for instance, or that Arlo had been able to feel the girl in black's magic much more than a slight tingling or pressure. No one could bring her the answers she needed. Arlo would have to get them herself. If she pretended she was only here to visit Celadon, and kept her ulterior, prying into private court matters motivations to herself, even the guards that harassed her the most couldn't send her away. She was still a member of the royal family after all, official Viridian or not. You should visit more often, Dag added, giving her a pointed look. A vine of ivy had begun to creep over his bulky shoulder, extending from the pillar just behind him, but he swatted it back with a practiced ease and stepped forward. Maybe then the High Prince would actually stay put when he's supposed to, and we wouldn't have to chase him around the city just to drag him back to work. Yeah, sorry, Arlo laughed. Poor Celadon. He hates paperwork, almost as much as he hates being indoors. Yes, poor Celadon. Definitely not poor me, who wasn't told a thing about your little cafe episode the other day, and therefore foolishly tried to stop your cousin from barreling out the door, as the High King himself instructed we do with his easily distracted son, under the assumption he was trying to escape from another meeting. Planting himself in front of Arlo, Dag stared hard up into her face, his dark brown eyes brighter than usual. Arlo winced. She knew how Celadon got when he was worried. Sorry, she apologized again. He's been acting really weird lately, worse than normal. I hope he wasn't rude to you. If he was, I promise to yell at him for you. Ha, like that would do him any good. Fae and their moods. I'm far too used to it to care anymore. Still, I hear the High Council might grant you that fancy VIP status, eh? You should consider moving into the palace if they do. Then some of us might be able to retire. He paused to double down on his meaningful look, and Arlo gave him an awkward chuckle in return. She'd almost forgotten about the weighing with everything else that had happened since, but she still didn't think it was very likely she was going to develop enough Fae qualities for the council's liking. All right, he said, a touch more firmly, drawing himself up to full height. He kept her gaze and said, You know the drill. Arlo nodded. State your name. Arlo Kion Jarsdell. Your purpose here today, Arlo Kion Jarsdell? Arlo willed her pulse to keep a calm and even pace, fighting the magic that compelled her to answer honestly. I'm here to visit High Prince Celadon. Dag twitched a nod and stepped out of her path, pressing no further than this. It was one of the oldest tricks in the book, the thrall. Anyone with even a drop of magic in their blood was subject to its rule. Fae and fairies alike found it difficult to lie by nature. It made them uncomfortable, and the greater the lie they tried to weave, the worse the resulting tension festered. Better instead to tilt the truth to flattering light, the magical community had discovered, and soon their clever games of convolution and careful omission became the common practice. Soon the magical community stopped telling outright lies altogether, but the fewer they told, the greater the power of truth became. Names, one of truth's greatest weapons, had become a means of control. The folk had taken to choosing second ones once they reached maturity, true names given out only to those they trusted with their lives, so as not to leave themselves vulnerable to harm. Arlo didn't have a second name, not yet, not until the Fae High Council granted her official status in the community as either Fae or common citizen. But she was still subject to this magic even with only her birth name. Fortunately, she had her protections. There was iron in her blood. If Dag decided to press a little harder with his questions and unearth the other half of her true purpose here today, she could count on her very human advantage. For all that lies indeed made her uncomfortable, it was nowhere near enough to force her to avoid them altogether. She could still tell them. She did still tell them. But Dag, it seemed, was happy to take her words at face value. Keep out of trouble, you hear? Arlo nodded again, shooting him a thumbs up. She scurried past him into reception, an enormous room carpeted by moss and pockets of springtime flowers, with towering oaks that grew in place of random pillars, the wide spread of their branches adding to the magicked canopy. In addition to this, an honest-to-God's thunderous waterfall had been built into the far opposite wall, and several pure gold statues of all the previous high sovereigns stood along the perimeter like overly resplendent guards. The revelry was busy today, but no more so than usual, given the hour. As the first few floors of the palace were given to public services, anyone was welcome to seek an audience with the High King or apply for approval for portal travel, trade, or various other licenses. Customs and immigration always saw the most traffic, with folks seeking visas to travel to other courts for prolonged periods of time, or citizenships to move between them. There was even a Tim Hortons off to Arlo's left, the Falchian police headquarters right beside it. Beside that was the home branch of the Court of Spring Bank, which everyone simply called COS Bank, and which operated much like a pawn shop. Here the folk could trade possessions for human currency, or exchange the money they earned from human jobs for trinkets and gems and bits of gold to spend at folk-run shops. Twittering birds of various breeds and colors darted from one perch to the next overhead, and among them hummingbird-like fairies flitted about, their lustrous plumage iridescent, their limbs slight as toothpicks, tending to the plant and wildlife with strength enough to lift things 10 times their size. A rain squall was moving across the ceiling. The rain that would soon fall from it was magic to evaporate before it touched anything, but the show always made people stop and gawk, causing even more congestion. A crowd had formed around the information center in the middle of the room, patrolled by burly ogres in Falchian police force garb. Numerous folk of a wide variety waited in the lavishly decorated sitting area for their turn to meet with the High King. The folk formed a veritable rainbow, pale peach and golden brown and jewel black, but turquoise violet and shocking pink too, muted butter yellow, diamond blue, and forest green. Some had features like tails and claws. Some were tall enough to brush the canopy, and some folk were so small Arlo had to watch where she stepped to avoid trampling them. She followed a sizable family of ink blue, spindly-limbed imps barely tall enough to reach her knees to the elevators that flanked the waterfall. Once upon a time, this had all run on magic. These days, much of the palace ran on electricity, part of the High King's attempt to show the magical community the benefits of relying less on magic that might give them away. The elevators on the right led to private and more specific government offices, but the elevator on the left led to the high floors of the revelry, devoted to the private home of the royal family and the library they kept for their personal use. It was here Arlo needed to go. "Afternoon, Arlo," greeted Callie, the fae on today's elevator duty. Her long violet hair was twisted into a tight bun behind her head, and her emerald and sage uniform was perfectly pressed and pristine. Arlo rarely saw any of the palace staff outside the building, where they could hide behind their glamours. She wondered if this was why she found their true appearance less disconcerting than what she sometimes saw elsewhere. Callie's unglamoured beauty was sharp, avian in a way, and ethereal to an almost unsettling degree. Her alabaster skin possessed a milky sapphire blue tint, and her whiteless eyes were a deep plum verging on black. "Hello, Callie," Arlo greeted politely in return. She stepped into the elevator, and Callie closed the gate behind her. "Floor 96, please. Off to bother Cell for a bit." Callie beamed. It was no secret she was part of the fan club that had built itself around Cell. But before she could comment or push the button for Arlo's floor, the elevator's grate was forced back open. "Oh, Lord Malachite," Callie spluttered, startled. She bent into a deep bow of apology. I'm so sorry, I didn't mean to close the grate on you. I didn't see you coming. Malachite Viridian Verdell, Arlo's uncle and her mother's only brother, glared down his prominent nose at Callie, but whatever comment he might have made in return was forgotten when he noticed Arlo. Arlo, he gasped, his enthusiasm as false as the smile that plastered itself on his ageless face. Much like the rest of Arlo's family, Malachite was tall and extraordinarily handsome. When he was without his glamours, as he was currently, the twilight glow of his royal status lent a greenish, pearly sheen to the blue flush that bled through his tanned skin. A distinct vulture hunger warped the aquiline edge of his features, with his grin showing off the tips of his much too sharp teeth. Are they training you for palace service too? He asked her, then flickered his gaze at Callie. As happy as I am that they found a use for you at last, maybe I should talk to someone about pairing you with better instruction. Callie practically wilted under Malachite's tone. He didn't seem to notice in the slightest. Wafting into the elevator, he jerked his head at the grate, indicating for Callie to close it behind him. Once settled into place at Arlo's side, he threw an arm around her shoulders. Come on, don't look so down. There's nothing wrong with honest work. Briar tells me you made a bit of a fuss at your weighing. I think considering that, you should be grateful you're allowed a position in the palace at all. His grin grew a little sharper, the green in his eyes so bright it was almost a fire. I mean, we can't all be foreign diplomats like High Prince Cerulean or world-renowned trackers like me. The flare of Arlo's anger was a familiar thing by now. She wanted to say something. She always wanted to say something whenever people like Malachite said such terribly rude things to her and the others around her, but the words would never leave her tongue. Every time she felt them bubbling up inside her, those good intentions turned to cowardice and were swallowed once more by nerves. Because Celadon and Elias were anomalies. Most of Arlo's family pretended she didn't exist. The High King was kind enough on the rare occasions Arlo met him, and the Crown High Princess Cerelia had always been cordial to her, but Arlo's maternal grandparents had been so displeased with Thallo's choice in husband that Arlo only really knew them from pictures. High Prince Cerulean acted like she was invisible when they crossed paths here at the palace. She had several other cousins and relations, however removed, who came and went, passing winds who thought nothing of asking rude and prying questions into her life and made very little effort to keep their whispers about her to themselves. But all of that was preferable to the way Malachite treated her right to her face, as though she was less than nothing and her humanity made her inadequate. His every comment was designed to fluster her too much to fight back. And that Malachite took so much pride in his profession was just about the best indication of his character as Arlo could find. Trackers were the magical community's police force for the creatures that didn't quite qualify as the court standards of people, and Malachite took perverse pleasure in being the one they often sent to neutralize what they deemed a threat to their peace. Better an attendant than a murderer, she said under her breath. What's that now, darling niece? Malachite had heard her. There was no way he hadn't, given his Fey-enhanced senses. But what Malachite perhaps hated more than Arlo's iron-born heritage was the fact that with her mother's high position and Celadon's affection, she was the one with more power. If only that actually helped her where it mattered. I said, what floor do you want? Sliding out from under her uncle's arm. She made for the panel of buttons on the wall. The look on Malachite's face said he was disappointed Arlo hadn't risen to his bait, that he knew full well Arlo wasn't in training with Callie and had meant his assumption as an insult. Malachite had insulted Arlo to tears so many times before that this pathetic jab was almost laughable. But the look on Callie's face made Arlo's stomach clench around her anger. You'll have to work on that bedside manner, he replied stiffly. Floor 23. I'll pass the news of your new ambitions on to Counselor Sylvain. He'll be glad to hear you're taking so well to your common station. I'm sure he will. She pressed his number, then her own. Shooting Callie an apologetic look, Arlo settled between them once more. Determined to make up in some way for her appalling family members, she pulled out her phone and held it awkwardly between them. We went to Niagara Falls for Celadon's birthday. He got really drunk and tried to liberate the sea life at Marineland. We're banned for life. Want to see pictures? Callie nodded vigorously. My nose has been so itchy today. Alright, well that was the end of chapter 9. So I'm gonna see who's on for me to raid. Oh my gosh, my nose is so itchy. I hate it. Oh, hello, Mur. Thank you for lurking. Yes, 'tis Mur. We're gonna raid Pyro, because I don't have anyone else on. One of my friends kept opening VTube Studio in Steam. I thought they were gonna start streaming, but I guess they weren't. They're just messing around in VTube Studio. Very upsetting. I wanted to raid them. What is today? Friday? Yeah, it's Friday. I'm so tired. I had to go to work super early this morning. But hopefully, should be reading again tomorrow after work. As long as nothing happens. I was trying to think if there was something else I needed to say. I'm so sleepy. Well, I guess we're gonna raid now. So bye!